Thank you so much, Farooq, Bharat, Parina, Diksha, all of you at Khaki Lab who've invited me to be here. I am actually logging in from Chicago, so it's actually wonderful that I am able to be in metaphorically in Mumbai. So I'm actually just going to share my screen a little bit, and I will say for many of you, a lot of this might be familiar, but that much of my research on Mumbai taxis actually comes from my own nostalgia for the city, which I've been very proud, and interestingly, it's been very poignant actually that my nostalgia is shared by so many people. So, okay, so I am, I'm a student of the city of Mumbai, but also someone who is a resident, former resident of the city of Mumbai. And I am an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, and I use all kinds of different ways in which to understand city life. So in order to tell the story of Mumbai taxis, I basically move between images, between archives, between sound, between film, and between ethnographic fieldwork, which I've been doing since 2010 with the Chillia taximen, but who are both drivers and mechanics. But I've also been working a lot with their families. So I'll try to give people a flavor as best I can of this broad swath of what the Mumbai taxi industry has looked like and felt like from the point of view of labor. So all of us have been passengers in taxis in Mumbai, of course. Everybody has a taxi story. But my interest was really to think about and to try to understand Mumbai's taxis, which is a very important part of Mumbai's labor history. And I wanted to understand it through through labor rather than through passengers. So of course, I'll start off, taxis, of course, in Mumbai have appeared in films, in art, in various different forms. So the image of the taxi resonates a great deal. I actually became one of my favorite films. Some of you will find this, we'll go back in time. I was only 5 years old when this film came out. This is Muzaffar Ali's Gaman. All right. Well, everybody has seen Gaman. Many of you have probably seen Gaman. And I think it's a film about taxi labor in the city of Mumbai with Farooq Sheikh, of course, who's the actor in it. And it represents in many ways a certain kind of melancholia about the city for taxi labor. Yeah, I know you can, for some reason, I think in this shared context, somehow the videos are not playing, which is, I'll maybe try and figure it out as we move through. So just a couple of weeks ago, I attended a Khaki Lab talk by Neera Adarkar. And Neera Adarkar gave such a beautiful talk on the chawls of Mumbai, and she took us through this lovely journey of how chawls as built environment are so closely tied to Bombay's social and cultural history. And in a similar spirit, actually, I am now thinking or going to, I see taxis in Bombay as very much a part, not of our stable built environment, but as part of our mobile cityscape. And they too, despite the fact that they're not fixed infrastructure, but are moving infrastructure, they tell us a story about social organization amongst drivers, mechanics, taxi unions, and also a political and industrial history of of India's early automobile industry. So I'll actually begin with very much the same places that Adarkar showed us, a whole lot of images, where she talked about the transformations of the mill districts in the Lower Parel area a couple of weeks ago. And there's all this built environment, new transformations of built environment coming up, of course, in the city. But if you see kaali-peeli taxis, if you look closely, taxis are always in the transformations of the built environment and infrastructure, and particularly kaali-peeli taxis, because these are taxis that are part of the city. This taxis that we can hail, we can, we can show up on the road and get into a kaali-peeli taxi. So In Mumbai, I always think that if we're thinking about Mumbai heritage, or both Mumbai's past, present, and future, that I think it's important to think about how different kinds of moving infrastructure are also embedded in the city. And our city has always been surrounded both by stable built infrastructures, transformations in those built infrastructures, but also always surrounded by movement. And while these are, of course, contemporary pictures, I have been working quite closely with a series of postcards. And so here you go. These are my kaali-peeli taxis, also part of the transformations of the built environment. So it's almost like you cannot even think of the Mumbai landscape without thinking of these moving forms of Bombay's heritage in many ways. But this has historical roots. So if you actually look back at, all kinds of, I've been doing this analysis of the intersections or interactions between Mumbai's built environment and Mumbai's movement. And you actually see all of the built environment, but it's always surrounded by movement. And, so you have these trams at Boribandar, you have, trams in places like Girgaon and Flora Fountain. So the presence of moving things has always been part of Mumbai's cityscape and Mumbai's landscape. Now we are a port city, so a lot of our landscape, if you might call it that, has also been marked by other forms of transport and movement. These are both fishing communities and dockyards and things like that. So our infrastructure or our heritage and our built environment has always incorporated all of these other kinds of forms which move, which don't necessarily stay in place. So as a result of which, I came to be very aware actually of how much of our attention to Bombay's heritage comes from our attention to the built environment and all that happens around it. But as I started to look more closely at Mumbai's taxi trade and started to ask a lot of questions about the taxi trade, I began to see and ask, what kinds of stories can we tell about Mumbai's past and Mumbai's present when we look at parts of the city that move, and when we start to tell and look at the stories of the people who actually move people, but also move things around. And I think that there's quite a lot of now interesting both academic work and journalistic work and visual and filmic work on dabbawalas and mathadis and dock workers and all of these. So people have always moved things around in Bombay, and those tell different kinds of stories about the city. So this is where my interest actually in taxis began. And this book I've written on Mumbai Taximen is actually what I would call a social history, but it's also an ethnography of drivers and everybody else connected to the taxi trade all the way from the late 19th century into the present. Now, for Mumbaikars, this is not going to be terribly new, but I think it might be nice to get us through some of the taxis over the decades. And what is interesting to me is that when you work with taxi drivers or anyone involved in the taxi industry, people's connections to the taxi are always connected to the brand of car that they drive. And this is important as we move towards thinking about our old Premier Padmini kaali-peelis, which have now been taken off the roads. So here we go, all kinds of cars as taxis. And I think each of them has a different place in the landscape of the city. So I want to just help the audience recognize that I'm not, my interest in taxis is not just about taxis, but it's to understand how Mumbai's taxi trade actually tells us something about urban migration, about caste formation, and especially Chillia caste formation, which I'll talk about as we move through the talk a little bit more. It also tells us an industrial and political history of the city through all of the car manufacturers who made these cars. So the first motor car, for those of you who don't know, was actually imported into India in 1898 which was actually around about the time when the Western world was also automobilizing. By the early 20th century, companies like General Motors, Studebaker, Fiat, they were all beginning to assemble commercial trucks and cars in Bombay, in Madras, and in Calcutta. And then between 1925 and 1950, a very wide range of passenger cars that were originally manufactured in Europe and the United States started being assembled in India. And they were being assembled in India, but they also started to be driven on Indian roads. And many, many older taxi drivers remember driving these cars that originally were just supposed to be assembled in India, but ended up being used in India. And this was, in the 1930s and 1940s. So what is important, I think, for us to, what I found very interesting and fascinating is that while India was a place for the assembly of cars, it also became a place where Indian engineers and users ended up learning a lot of engineering skills to adapt those cars to Indian contexts. And then, of course, in the 1940s, you have, the Hindustan Motors, which was set up in 1942 by the Birla brothers, and Premier Automobiles, which was established in 1944 in Bombay by Walchand Hirachand. So most of us, of course, know taxis and taxiwalas through our interactions as passengers. And I know that possibly many of you here have come here for this talk because you have a sort of shared nostalgia for older kaali-peelis. And particularly now in the context of the retirement of, now we have these kinds of taxis as well, right? But in the context of the retirement of these old kaali-peelis, the Padmini kaali-peeli, which all of us now think of as Bombay's heritage. So there is a certain kind of, when we think about heritage, we think about a certain kind of nostalgia. But I like to use nostalgia, I think, in the sense that the kaali-peeli drivers, whose families have been driving cars for over a century, use it. And they use it in a way by calling themselves, of course, for Mumbaikars, this is not an unfamiliar term, they call themselves Juna drivers, right? Now, being Juna is not just about being old. It's a nostalgia in many ways that is a jumble between yearning for a different place, yearning for a different time. But in the end, for many people, and I think many of us might feel this too, it's really yearning for a way to find a new home in a different world, or a new place in a different world. And that's why I think that when I started to trace this story of Juna drivers and Juna taxis, particularly the community I've been working with, which is the Chillia, who are Gujarati Muslims from the Palanpur region of Gujarat. And working with them, I started to see that nostalgia, or heritage, if you might call it that, was complicated because, it was a way to find a way back, but it was also a way to find a way forward as to how to live in a new world. So, and I think what has been quite poignant for me is that my nostalgic inclinations, the nostalgic inclinations of the drivers, have also found all kinds of collective spirit in various places with so many people. And this is precisely how there's a wonderful architectural theorist who actually differentiates between this thing of melancholy, which is something that individuals feel, and nostalgia, which connects all of us through our individual and collective memory. And this is, I think, where questions of heritage really lie, at least for me. So when I presented my work in public, Indians, and a photograph of this Premier Padmini taxi floats onto the screen, Indians in my audience, especially Mumbaikars, who came of age in early post-colonial India, always begin to reminisce joyfully. And people have tears in their eyes, people have all kinds of affection for this car, and in many ways, for the lost times that it seems to signify. And so many people have always come up to me and said, oh, the Padmini, it's the quintessential taxi, it's the quintessential jugaad car. And they also thank me for reminding them of happier times, of a car, of a city, and of a life that they associate with some kind of a lost place. And I realized that so many of us, Mumbaikars, Indians, have a premier Padmini story, just as they do a taxi story. And the taxi story often overlaps with the story about the car. So when we talk about heritage, and I feel like, working with these taxis, thinking about the taxi trade over the last century in Bombay, I find that heritage, that when we talk about our heritage or our history, while the stuff of heritage is important, the artifacts, the built environment, the things of heritage, but heritage is also very much about collective memory. And I think that, so many people recount memories of their first romantic encounters in a kaali-peeli, or of taking a kaali-peeli on a rainy afternoon to the cinema, or for kulfi on Chowpatty Beach, or to Badshahs for Faluda in Crawford Market. And some of the fondest memories that people actually have are when the families, people who owned Padminis as individuals, as private owners, not as taxi owners, the Padmini, which was very limited in its production early on, and people booked it and had to wait for months and months or years to get it. But yeah, and then when they got it, it would break down. And some of the fondest memories people recount are when the family's Padmini, which was the pride and joy of the household, broke down on a family outing, and someone had to get out and fiddle with the car, while everyone else got out to push the car through the monsoons or the heat or whatever. And in these cases, I always found that all our stories about our Padmini in Bombay was also a Padmini breakdown story, which was simultaneously a story of collective work. And I think that Mumbai's taxi industry really shows us, because India had very low private ownership of cars. And it continues to actually per capita. When you're on the roads in Mumbai, you don't feel that, of course, because you're always stuck in a traffic jam. But per capita, we still have a very low private ownership. And Mumbai's taxi industry actually shows us that there is the story of Indian cars and Indian automobiles is quite distinct from what you see in the Western world. Because until, when in societies like ours, where private car ownership remains low per capita, taxis are actually the majority of public cars on the road. So the taxi is a public vehicle. And this is quite different from how cars and people adopted cars in the Western world. Because in the Western world, cars are symbols of individualism, alienation from the public. But in places like India, early cars always needed collective care, or what taxi drivers that I work with call dekbhal, which often coincides with dekbhal, not just of the car, but also of the family. So, and part of this is that many cars, and especially taxis, because taximen were the main users of early Indian cars, early cars in India were technologically incomplete. And part of this was that this is due to all kinds of very rigid customs duties on imported technology. So particular parts were actually deliberately not in a car, in the Indian car. And so Indian car manufacturers and engineers, and ultimately those who used cars the most, and taxiwalas were the ones who used cars the most, they always had to adapt the car and adjust from other things. And so this encouraged all kinds of local mechanics and engineers to expand their ingenuity, and it made cars open to a wide variety of adaptations. So actually, if you talk to a kaali-peeli driver today, especially those who drove Padminis, they'll say, my brother's car look is different. It has something different. Mine is different. Because so this idea of, the Jugaad car was actually built into India's automobile history. So it was absolutely necessary for these cars to require all kinds of adaptations and change. And so the reality of this incomplete technology and technical possibility was particularly important to taxi drivers. And they always lavished affection and upgrades to the car, because that was a matter of necessity. And it always involved those who drove and those who rode. And it always involves the collective work. So many of the old taxi drivers, the Juna drivers, especially the Chillia drivers I've been working with, the connections between driving and mechanics have been sutured historically. So people are both drivers, have always been both drivers and mechanics for this very reason. And so this is again where, even taxi driving in the Western world, that, it's not, cars in the Western world are symbols of alienation. In India, actually, especially taxis, they have been symbols in many ways of social growth and social interaction when it comes to labor. So, when you start to study hereditary drivers, you learn actually that Mumbai's taxi is many things. It's a material object that is driven. It provides some insight into India's industrial history and transnational relations with the world, because, for example, Premier Automobiles, who actually manufactured the Padmini, that became this iconic Bombay taxi over the last few decades, Premier began as car assemblers through a partnership with the Chrysler Corporation in the US, and then of course with Fiat in Italy for the Padmini itself. So the taxi is all these things. It's an economic and political connection. It sutures global connections. It's an expression of kinship, because most early taxi driving was always a hereditary profession. And they're also a very important part of Mumbai's landscape. And now, what is actually quite, as we think about heritage, so I'm trying to move us through these different aspects of heritage and how we come to think of cars and taxis as heritage in the city. Because many, I found that taxis continue to animate things in Bombay even as ruins. And this is an important point, because I found all over Mumbai, for Mumbaikars, this is not going to be terribly revealing, but many of you who are in Mumbai will actually see that these, ruins of taxis are actually a very, very common sight along roadsides in the city. And they have almost become part of the built environment. So it's not just the moving taxi, but also the ruined taxis. And it's interesting to actually see how ruins of taxis still do something in the city. And increasingly, these discarded taxis, you see actually both the fleet taxis and the kaali-peelis are being used for different things. This is an old discarded taxi being used as a place of waiting at the RTO. They're being used as dustbins. They're being used to, they have afterlives, because in this case, for example, I find it interesting that this is a young man who's trying to mine this old Maruti van taxi for spare parts. So I find it that, interesting, on this one, for example, it has Chalo Haji Ali, right? So it shows that taxis, this is an artifact that at one time perhaps was full of life and hope by taking tourists to these important tourist landmarks, but it's now been discarded, but it continues to provide other kinds of value. So this is the, so when you think about the Bombay taxi, it is very much a story of a living past, even in its ruins or its afterlives, and very much an artifact of the present and the future. So let's move now a little bit to some of our earliest taxis. Okay. The earliest taxis, of course, the taxi industry in Bombay begins with garis or Victoria taxis. And throughout the 20th century, you see these pictures. These are all, professional Victoria drivers. And throughout the 20th century and into this contemporary period, taxis have always been central to Mumbai's transport politics, but also its aspirations to urban modernity. So even these garis and Victorias that came onto the roads in Bombay right about the time that they were also being driven in London and many of the other parts of the Western world. So the taxi industry actually in Bombay actually was very much part of a global structure of transport. And it was a way in which India actually claimed a certain kind of urban modernity. And the taxi trade, of course, has historically always been organized around groups of self-employed labor from specific ethnic and linguistic groups. And drivers and mechanics who identify as Chillia are central to this expansion of the trade. And maybe some of you might know this, but British colonial Bombay was actually the very first Indian city to develop a systematic taxi trade in the late 19th century, when we had these Aghadis or Victorias on the road. Interestingly, Bombay was also the very first Indian city to adopt a motorized taxi trade in the early 20th century. And it was automobiles from France and the United States, actually, which first appeared in colonial Bombay around 1908 and 1909. And Indian transport labor was actually the very first adopter of some of these new cars and new technologies. So, at the present moment, of course, we now have, today, we see that there are all kinds of taxi wars. Here are some other photographs of Victoria taxis. And actually, if you notice, many of these taxi drivers that appear in these images are actually wearing this, what is known actually as the Palanpuri topi. And when I showed these photographs, I work with postcards, and I actually show a lot of these photos to the people, the Chillia community that I work with, and they can often identify or speculate on who that person is. Of course, we don't know whether that's actually true, but what is interesting is that that people feel as though that people feel as though they can trace a certain kind of family history back to the early taxi trade. And today, of course, we have all these taxi wars. Every time you open a newspaper, there's a war about different kinds of taxis, fares, etc., etc. But what is actually quite interesting for me here again, this is actually Apollo Bandar, where I actually spent most of my childhood. I was delighted to come across some of these photographs of old taxi drivers, old Victoria drivers, again, if you look closely, wearing the Palanpuri topi, which is a very distinct kind of topi. The Chillia drivers no longer wear Palanpuri topis, but the early drivers did. So right from the very beginning, actually, of the taxi trade, there's been a lot of heated debates in the taxi industry about fares, meters, etc. So all of the things that we're seeing today about people debating, the arguments, fights between the kaali-peeli trade and the Ola and Uber and all of this, or the arguments between the taxi drivers and taxi unions and the government or the transport authorities over meters and fares. These actually have a very, very long, deep history. All the way back to from the 1920s onwards, you actually see that there's all kinds of arguments, all kinds of political and labor movements. Taxi strikes have been going on since the 1930s. So taxis have always been tied right from the start of Bombay's history to political and labor politics of the city. And they've actually been intertwined with the labor movements that many of us know more about in the industrial sector. And the Taxi Association was founded in the 1920s by Mr. S.H. Jhabwala, who was a very prominent trade unionist and a member of the Communist Party and a member of the Bombay Legislative Assembly. And then you have the Taximen's Union, which was founded in 1960 by George Fernandez, also a very prominent trade unionist that most Mumbaikars are familiar with. So what is actually important to remember in the taxi industry is that labor movements that were taking place in the industrial sector, the textile sector, were always intertwined with labor movements in the transport sector. And many of the leaders of the labor movements actually went back and forth between, they actually held positions, both as leaders in the textile and industrial sector, but also in the transport and transport labor sector. So what is important, I think, then for us to see is, I see that in my own archival work, by the 1940s and 1950s, it was the taxi trade, as India was developing cars and automobiles, it was the taxi trade that actually buttressed early post-colonial India's automobile production. Because during this period, we actually see these new regulations that come about, because up until then, there had been all kinds of speculators and fleet owners who exploited drivers and owned these large fleets of cars. But by the early post-colonial period, as India was becoming independent, there was all kinds of policies that were put in place that encouraged owner operators. So people to own their own cars and buy Indian cars that were being produced by, especially by Indian companies like Premier. So basically what this meant is that there were all kinds of new incentives for drivers. There were cooperative societies that were set up to help drivers actually start to own their means of production, to own their own cars. And the rise of taxi cooperatives in the 1950s actually gave a lot of energy to ownership, the owner-operator model. And drivers say that they actually got quite a lot of enhanced power and financial support to own their own cars. And so this self-employed structure of taxi driving remained the norm until the late liberalization of the Indian economy, when of course all kinds of other things like taxi modernization, etc., where taxi fleets like Meru and all of these were introduced. And in Bombay, because Bombay already had this very established taxi industry, the entry of these new kinds of taxis actually created a very different kind of politics than one saw in other cities that did not have that kind of established taxi trade. And then, of course, by 2013, Ola and Uber and all these come into India. So a lot of the debates over getting rid of old kaali-peelis or Juna cars, the Premier Padmini, all of the new amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act emerge after the move to CNG, which was a less polluting fuel, as all of us know. And then, of course, the shutdown of the Premier automobile factory in 2000 when Padminis were no longer manufactured. And so then we started to see this debate over how long a car could stay on the roads, etc., etc. But it's important, I think it's important for me to turn a little bit to the company that actually produced the model of car and has a very significant place in our recent memory of the taxi industry. So Premier, Mumbaikars, I'm sure many of you know the corporate history much better than I do, but I'm very grateful to Maitreya Doshi at Premier Automobiles, who gave me free access to all of their archives and images and all of that. But it was, of course, Premier Automobiles was founded by Walchand Hirachand in 1944. And initially, of course, they started as assemblers for the Chrysler Corporation and then tied up with Fiat in Italy. And all of these early agreements with American car manufacturers, what happened is Indian engineers from Premier Automobiles were consistently traveling between Detroit, Chrysler and Detroit. And I've actually done quite a lot of archival research in the Chrysler archives in the US. And it's actually quite interesting that Chrysler actually almost glosses over this very important partnership that they had with Premier. But in Premier archives, the partnership with Chrysler and Fiat is all over the place. And I think it's important to remember that Indian engineers were consistently, this was part and parcel of early post-colonial India's industrialization plan, is that Indian engineers were consistently moving between Chrysler in Detroit and Turin in Italy, which is where Fiat is based. And one of the things that I think a lot of people think is that the automobile is really a Western technology that was transferred from the West to the rest of the world. But India actually shows that this clear division between where the technology originated and how it was innovated on actually muddies the water quite a bit. So, by 1946, many of you would know, of course, that Premier had purchased a plot of land for their factory near Kurla in the suburb of Bombay. And by 1947, the construction and assembly building in Kurla had been completed. And so these are some pictures of the massive expansion in industrialization of Indian automobiles, which was often not always supported actually by the Indian government. And the reason that India had to have quite so many Indian automobile manufacturers had to have so many relationships with foreign firms is because the Indian government actually did not prioritize passenger cars until much, much later. Until actually Maruti came into being, which was in fact partially a government operation. So there was a lot of, the taxi industry became a very important customer for these cars, But Premier also actually exported a lot of their cars to places like Bangladesh and Mauritius and things like that. Many car manufacturers now today say that they tried to tap into the taxi markets at a time when private consumers did not exist in the same bulk quite as extensively. So they tapped into the taxi market to sell their cars. But what often ended up happening for car manufacturers is as soon as cars were used as taxis, it diluted the brand. And I think many people might say that this is what happened to the Premier Padmini, is that as soon as it became the iconic taxi, the public car, the private sales started to go down. And I think there's plenty of debate about whether in today's day, whether Hyundai Santro has the same problem, because the Santro has been used so much as a taxi. So anyway, so the taxi so we cannot understand the taxi trade without understanding the places from which the cars were actually produced and the relationships between the taxi industry as a public good and the private car manufacturers that were actually trying to make enormous amounts, obviously needed to make profits. So, okay, so I'm going to move really quickly now to my final part of the presentation, which is, we've talked about industrial history, we've talked about the artifacts, we've thought about how taxis continue to animate politics, have afterlives from their ruins, how they're part of the built landscape. But what about the people who actually started out as taxi drivers? So I'll move a little bit now to, here are some more images of industrial production in the Kalyan and Kurla plants of Premier Automobiles. And these were very important places from which industrial labor, this is the kind of industrial labor that was very important to the history of Bombay, to the spatial politics of the city. And Kalyan and Kurla really became car places for automobiles. In fact, even today, if you go to Kurla, you see pretty much, lots and lots of car service companies and, lubricant shops, etc. Okay. All right, the kaali-peeli. This is a photograph from the area that I've been doing most of my work, which is an area in Malad called Pathanwadi. So Chillia families began migrating to Bombay in the early 20th century from the Palanpur region, neighboring state of Gujarat. And they were the ones who began as drivers of Victoria taxis. And what is interesting, I think, to remember is actually Chillia identify as low-caste Muslims. But what is interesting is they're not actually dispossessed of land and resources in Palanpur. So their experiences of urban migration into the city are marked not so much by poverty and dispossession in the village, as much as they are marked by this real desire to be part of Bombay's exciting urban world in the early 20th century. And this is an urban world of the city, but it's also an urban world of cars, of mechanics, of the possibility to develop technological expertise, and of course, the mastery over urban landscapes. So Chillia actually identify as, here we go. Okay. Chillia identify as Sunni Muslims of the Momin caste. And in Gujarat, the bulk of Momins are actually found in the Banaskantha district in and around the area of Palanpur, which was a princely state, formerly princely state of India. And a lot of princely families used to import horses from the Persian Gulf, and as marks of their cosmopolitanism and upper class status. And stables were actually a very important place for low caste Muslim labor who would otherwise be involved in marginal or petty trades. And many of these people, actually, many of these communities who were experts in stables and horses, take their knowledge with them into the city and followed other family members into the transport trades. And they started as drivers of Victoria taxis. By around 1911, Victorias began to share the road with motorized cars. And as the Victorias disappeared, the Palanpuri carriage drivers moved to motorized, they moved into the motorized trade, but they moved together. Now, the needs of the taxi trade, why is it this neighborhood I've been living in and working in in Pathanwadi actually is made up entirely of taxi drivers and car mechanics. And this has a history, because the history of the early taxi trade manifested itself spatially, because you had horses and cars and family members, all of whom were involved in the taxi trade. These residential communities that were built around spaces where people could park their Victorias and things came about. Of course, we know a lot about the wonderful residential arrangements of the industrial labor in the mill districts and things, but I think what I found fascinating is that many, many other kinds of labor obviously have a long, deep history of spatial development around labor. And so the cultural dynamics of a labor economy among Bombay's Muslim communities influenced in many ways how Palanpuri moments came to be in the taxi trade and have persisted. So Palanpuri is actually, the drivers identify as Momin. Momin broadly translates to mean true believer. And during the early decades of the 20th century, Muslim weavers and other similar occupational groups in other parts of India mobilized against higher status Muslim elite under this community called Momin. And for Palanpuri drivers in Bombay, this low status or low caste position, what they see as a caste, intersected with circumscribed possibilities of labor and work in the city. And of course, the thing is that that caste is a complicated thing in Muslim communities, because while we study caste in India among Hindus very widely, there are all kinds of systems of stratification among South Asian Muslims, Indian Muslims, that actually receive much less attention. And, what is important, what I found interesting among Chillia communities is that Chillia is very much, I came to understand it as a caste identity that is Bombay, okay? And it was very telling when I said I wanted to visit Palanpur, where most of my taxi drivers that I work with have actually very, very strong family roots. I was instructed, please don't refer to the term Chillia at all. I will be misunderstood. No one in Palanpur will know what you're talking about. At home, we are Momin. In Mumbai, we are Chillia. This is, and the interesting thing in Bombay is, of course, that we all know these terms, but we've taken them for granted. But these are caste formations that actually have come about as part of urbanization into the city. So Palanpuri Momins who actually migrate elsewhere are not known or do not identify as Chillia. It is only the Bombay migrants who identify like this. And as Palanpuri Momins migrated into Bombay in the early 20th century in search of employment, they used a lot of these caste formations and ethnic and kin networks to monopolize three important trades in the city. So in the words of Yusuf, who's one of the drivers I've been working with for a long time, he says, for Chillia and Mumbai, you can say our dhanda is HMT. Can any Mumbaikar here guess what that is? Hotel, motor, tabela, HMT. So this caste identification has actually been very important to gain entry into these three trades, and for Palanpuri Momins to consolidate themselves as small capitalists by establishing these Khandani dhandas in the HMT trades. So I asked a lot of people, when you think about caste formation and caste as this, especially Muslim caste, as this flexible way in which people gain access to resources in the city, I actually tried to get to many, and there's very little documentation of the period in which this caste term actually comes about. So all of the knowledge that has been produced about this has come from oral histories. So one of the drivers I've worked with again for a long time, Ismail, says, in my great-grandfather's time, Chillia all drove horse buggies. During that time, most of the buggy drivers were from our caste in Gujarat, and we spoke Gujarati. Gujarati, has a lot of chi, cha, cha, so people just started to call us cha, cha, Chillia. All of the people around him laugh. Yasir, Ismail's brother-in-law, he explains this somewhat differently. He says the family name was Shelia. But during the British period, there were many Parsis in Bombay who used buggies and cars driven by Shelia. And Parsis, of course, mispronounced the name, and we just became Chillia. Everyone erupts in laughter again. Ismail's brother, Abdul, repeats this story of mispronunciation, but he says, actually, it was the British who mispronounced our name, not the Parsis. So whatever the story is, collectively, one can actually assume that this Chillia as a caste identity was a product of later colonial Bombay, where Chillia were interacting with the urban elite and they were trying to stake opportunities to access different kinds of capital. So the taxi industry is very much tells us, if you start to look at it from the labor perspective, okay, here you go. There's a lot. This is Pathanwadi. So once you start to look at the taxi industry through labor, you start to recognize, I think, that these are, how is it that small capital got produced, or how is it that people gained access to as small capitalists to the various aspects of the city, and caste identification, caste formations that occurred as part of labor formations, which were articulated as first as a labor identity, but then begins to encompass all kinds of other things so that Chillia start to identify themselves as different from other workers becomes quite important. So, the Chillia actually used this caste term to identify themselves from other drivers. There were other ethnic groups that also were early taxi drivers, Konkani Mangaloreans and the Sikhs. The Sikh drivers have now moved into, yeah, absolutely. I see this in the chat too. Sikh drivers moved into heavy driving, like truck driving, etc. The Konkani Mangaloreans moved into white-collar professions because they had a higher access to literacy. And Chillia, of course, not all Chillia have also moved into other trades, but they still continue to think of themselves as the original Juna drivers. So, Pathanwadi is actually a very, very important. It's a very dense residential space that is occupied by a wide array of working class Muslims from pretty much every part of India, actually. And every region of India, every Muslims from different regions who speak different languages have created these different kinds of pockets based on trade and linguistic things. And, when I mentioned to friends in Mumbai when I first started doing this work, their universal reaction was, oh, do you feel safe there? Okay. And although this was a curious and rather disappointing question, it's not surprising actually in the context of contemporary Mumbai, because working class settlements, and I find this very much, I live in Chicago, working class settlements, particularly Muslim working class settlements, much like Black neighborhoods in the city I live in the US, are misrecognized from the outside as spaces of hopelessness and illicit economic activity, rather than as spaces of really legitimate accumulation of capital and the making of life. And Pathanwadi is very much a place where there is this historical, deep history of small capitalism and really genuine, vibrant life making. And it's and it's built, the life making and capital is all built around the taxi industry, but it's also built around how, capital accumulation in India has always been connected to religious, ethnic, linguistic, linguistic identities, and Chillia is certainly one of them. So, there's so much wonderful work on the residential formations around mill districts and the vibrant life of textile and industrial work. And I find that there's Rajnarayan Chandravarkar has written beautifully about this. Neera Adarkar has done a beautiful talk, has written lots and lots of interesting things about this too. But the vibrant social communities that have emerged around all these other kinds of capital are actually also very interesting and important to the life of the city of Bombay. So I'm going to jump ahead for purposes of time. But what I will say is that Chillia, a lot of the Chillia communities' historical and persistence in the taxi trade has come from their idea or their real pride in following Islamic principles in their capital accumulation, which means that taxis are collectively owned. In many cases, about 18 people depend on one car. And but they also cannot leave the taxi trade quite as easily, because the kaali-peeli trade for Chillia is also a form of social control. And drivers, that there's a lot of people, many in Mumbai's social and technocratic elite have told me, why is it that they just don't change, right? Why don't they leave? So one executive in Ola, for example, said to me, why don't they leave the past behind and move into the 20th century or 21st century? Because they will lose their jobs one day and they will regret it. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Chillia and many self-employed drivers actually see moving into other kinds of trades as a loss of autonomy. And this is across the world. You actually see transport workers pride themselves on a certain form of autonomy or a rejection of ghulami. And taxi drivers actually see, especially Chillia drivers, see these new taxi services as not providing opportunities for social accumulation, and that they are more geared at individual profit rather than as collective profit. And Islamic economics actually says that profit, Muslims are supposed, the Quran actually says Muslims must make money. They must participate in a vibrant economic life, but money and wealth should not accumulate too much with one person. It needs to be shared. And so the self-employed taxi trade actually is a remarkably wonderful way, actually, in order to both live as a good Muslim and as a profitable urban citizen or an urban capitalist. So in the words of one of my Chillia drivers, one taxiwala, when people are constantly telling him he needs to drop this kaali-peeli and move, he says, there's one thing about being a Juna driver in Bombay. And this goes back to my original discussion of nostalgia and how do you find a way or a place or a life in a new world. He says there's one thing about being a Juna driver in Mumbai, and it's this: you have knowledge of roads and politics. You have dignity because your feet are on the ground. Ola and Uber can manipulate the software to send their drivers to the moon. But Juna drivers are here on the roads and in the city. The roads are jammed and painful, but I will take the city rather than be manipulated to fly to the moon any day. And I think this is really an important, I'll end here because I think this is an important way in which to recognize the histories of labor in a city like Bombay have emerged out of all kinds of very important forms of knowledge formation. So these are people who know the trade incredibly well. And they are not only knowledgeable, but they're also critics of their own trade. They're also critics of their own city. And it becomes a way in which to think about. I think they are they become places from which we can understand where Bombay was, but also where we might go as a city. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tarini Bedi. It was so fascinating. I really love that line which you had over there. At home, we are Momin. In Mumbai, we are Chilias. There have been a few questions. We'll get to them in a bit. But I want to ask you first, when some of us were at least growing up, there used to be this little fellow sitting next to the taxiwala. It was called the barkia, the assistant, somebody who would assist the driver. Did your work include a study of those people who assisted in the driving trade, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question, Farooq. So there were often assistants, and I think that we have to think of this. And I know that many Mumbaikars, we were always told, oh, don't get into the car where there's a second person sitting in the seat, etc. And I think that was a misunderstanding of the fact that actually the taxi trade, especially among hereditary drivers, has followed for a long time the apprenticeship model. Mm-hmm. And so we always understand in a white collar profession, oh, somebody's sitting by me and is watching what I'm doing. But this is very much an apprenticeship model. And often the assistant was someone who could not. So very often the assistant was somebody in the family who was not, as knowledgeable about the road. So very often it was an assistant to, yes, I did often have people who assisted, and they were usually younger members of the family, or they were new entrants into the trade who were apprentices. And they were apprentices not just for driving. And, I think that this is important, is that, driving is about knowledge.
Mhm.
We no longer think of driving as knowledge. I put on my phone and my GPS takes me wherever I want to go. And so my sensory interaction with the city is very different, right? But traditionally or historically, taxi driving was also about knowledge, and knowledge was to be shared. And the assistant was usually an apprentice who was actually sharing the knowledge. And that's quite, that was quite common. So absolutely, yeah. And I see a lot of people in the chat. So when I say that I'm doing work with Chillia drivers, there are all kinds of, the taxi industry in Bombay is proliferating with all kinds of people, Konkanis, Biharis, of course. And I think that they are now developing, people from Bihar and UP and other parts of the Konkan are now developing these networks. They cannot enter the Chillia taxi trade. So what, I think we have to recognize that social groups give access to resources, and some are much more precariously placed. Newer migrants are much more precariously placed. And newer migrants now actually access a lot of their rights through unions and associations. And of course, the proliferation of unions that have come from political parties. Now, every political party in Mumbai has a taxi union. And, but yeah, go ahead.
As part of your research, did you come across any resentment for these new drivers from the Juna drivers, so to speak? And how did it manifest itself?
Yeah. So, there is a lot of, I don't think it's resentment. I think it's always positioned. Of course, there are all kinds of issues, people, and this is somewhat the sad part of the whole thing, is that these taxi wars, what they end up doing is pitting the working classes against each other, right? These are all men trying to make a life. And the new drivers like Ola and Uber. So there is you read in the news, you open the papers every day, there's some hangama between kaali-peeli drivers and Ola drivers or Uber drivers. But I think a lot of the manifestation of the resistance is not so much against the Ola and Uber drivers, but it is against the changing structures of labor. Mm-hmm. And that is what, I think most of the resentment is targeted at. And I wouldn't even call it resentment. I think it's, I think, people know things. When you do something wonderfully well, you are going to be a critic of things that are done differently. Yeah. And I think that's where it lies. But it is the shifting structures of labor rather than individual resentment towards particular corporations or companies. It's the ways in which labor structures are changing.
It's changing for them.
Yeah. And this is happening everywhere in the world. It's not just an India story or a Mumbai story anymore. It is a Mumbai story in the sense that, taxi labor and transport labor has this hereditary history. But the actual the fight or the struggle against the changing structures of labor is
the key to all.
Is the key. Yeah.
Meera Devi Dayal says that in 2005 she had an exhibition called Tum Kab Aoge, and it was a takeoff on the taxi driver as a migrant, and the taxi becomes a metaphor for home. She would love to connect with you. If it's okay with you, can we share your email address with her?
Absolutely. Meera Devi Dayal, I've actually seen much of your wonderful, beautiful artwork on taxi drivers. And yes, it's home, that we always think of taxis as places of movement. But for many people, they're places also of rest and dwelling, right? How many of us see, Meera Devi Dayal, I know you have this lovely photograph of people, the taxi driver's feet hanging out of the kaali-peeli car. And taxis are very important places of rest, very much so.
I have shared your email address in the chat box.
Thank you.
Isa, who's an architect come anthropologist, says that he finds a lot of Chilias around Murgagiran in Forest Road and near Arabia Belicis Road. They own many small and cheap restaurants there. Are there any links to ponder upon? Isa is our thinker.
Yeah. No, thanks, Isa. Thank you. Absolutely. There are Chillia. And, that is the thing, is that in Mumbai, of course, there are certain restaurants, we don't even call them by the name of the restaurant, it's just called the Chillia, right, where you get the biryani or whatever. So there
Colaba
are
girl,
connections.
you'll be familiar with Olympia and Colaba.
Of course, of course. I mean, there's so many Chillia restaurants. Yes, there are connections. They are Chillia, and as as Chillia actually say that they are HMT, small restaurants, hotel, which of course, when I say hotel in the US, people think it's a place to sleep, but hotel is a restaurant, like place to eat in India. So absolutely, there are connections. Many Chillia drivers actually move, some of their younger members of their families actually move back and forth between being little, people who help in the Chillia restaurant. And then once they can drive, they come back into the taxi trade. So there is quite a lot of back and forth. And it's based on the fact that they are Chillia. They come from the same place. They often have, they lived in close contact, or they feel that they were closely in contact from the village, and therefore they make a home and a life in a city. Absolutely.
So I don't know if there's an anthropological reason for what Rajneesh is asking. He's lived in both Delhi and Mumbai. So he says in Delhi, we used to take an auto to go search for a taxi earlier on. And in Bombay, it was never like that. What could be the anthropological reasons for that? I'm sure there are geographical reasons,
Yeah.
you live in colonies and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, that's a great, that's actually a wonderful sort of spatial question and a difference in the structures of the city. And I think the Bombay taxi industry, which is quite, the Delhi taxi industry has always been, in fact, structured around not so much self-employed labor, but around, one man who owns a whole bunch of fleets, a whole bunch of cars, and then he stands at the taxi stand. And then you have to go and find the taxi at the taxi stand, or you phone up and ask for the taxi. So the call taxi has always been the case in places like Delhi. But Bombay has always had these hail taxis. And I will say part of it is, Bombay's taxi industry mirrors much less the taxi industry in other parts of India than it does taxis in other parts of the world. The hail taxis, in London or in Paris or New York. So and that's one of the things that many old taxi drivers, Juna taxi drivers say, is that they are part of a global modernity as Mumbai taxi drivers, because they reflect what happens in other modern, so-called Western modern parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And yes, Calcutta is another one, of course. Calcutta has the ambassadors, and that's partially, of course, because Hindustan Motors was based there, and they started selling ambassadors to the taxi company, taxi trade there. So Calcutta may be a little bit more similar to Bombay. But Bombay taxi drivers, Juna drivers, even the trade union leaders and all have always made claims for the Mumbai taxi trade based on the fact that it's the most modern. It reflects urban modernity most because it can be hailed. And it can be hailed because taxis are not just they're not just transport modes, but they're in the city. They're the life of the city. They belong there. They move around. They're part of as I said, part of the built environment.
So that answers our next question from Commander Mohan Narayan, and you've explained about why the ambassadors were popular in Calcutta. What about Chennai and other smaller metropolitan cities like Cochin? They were also dominated mostly by the ambassadors, not the Premier Padmini. Any reason for that?
I don't have an answer to that, but that's a really good question, because I don't know the histories of cars and things in those cities. But I don't have an answer. I think that it probably was just a better marketing of Hindustan Motors into other parts of the country, mm-hmm. Whereas Premier actually had such a high demand for taxis that they were not really, I think that their own city their own drivers became such big consumers of those cars that they perhaps it didn't make its way. And it's interesting, you're right, that Premier Padminis did not make their way into other cities in ways that ambassadors did. I don't have an answer to what's going on in Cochin or any place. I'm sorry.
Aditya wants to know, he believes that he's heard that Sikh taxi drivers move outside of Mumbai after the 84 riots. And that resulted in many drivers coming in from UP and Bihar. Would you corroborate that? Would that be an accurate?
I think that, certainly, I think 1984 certainly must have had impacts. But I think that Sikh drivers also, and I will say, some of the taxi association, for example, in Mumbai is still headed by a Sikh driver, a former driver. So the Sikh drivers continue to be part of the leadership of the taxi industry. But as actual drivers, yeah, they move. I think what happened is that Sikh drivers, after the 1984 riots, 84 massacres, and 84 threats to the Sikh community in cities, I think Sikh drivers became more comfortable as moving, as less connected to space, and therefore they took on truck driving. So Sikh drivers are, moved into heavy motoring. And I suspect what has happened is that once you have communities moving into that, then it becomes a network for more people to do so. So Sikh drivers, I suspect that is what has happened, which means that, what in the 1950s and 60s, those of us who lived in Bombay and took taxis, you may have come across far more Sikh drivers than you do today. But Sikhs have moved into heavy motoring. So truck driving, interstate bus driving, that kind of thing is what they're doing much more of. But they still remain in the transport states.
Question from Smriti Kopikar. The old taxi trade tried very briefly to join the modern economy with the cool cabs and the silver AC, but that was wiped out by the new age Ola, Ubers. Any thought on that?
Yeah, no, that's interesting because the taxi industry, so, I found this quite intriguing as I was doing my archival research. We all complained about how taxis were not, air conditioned and all of that. And then the cool cabs came about. And really, actually, non-air conditioning is built into the regulatory structure of, can everyone please turn off their, sorry.
Mute, please.
Yeah. So, the lack of air conditioning is built into the industrial policy of car manufacturing, actually. So air conditioning was very limited in old Indian cars because it required so much, because there were all kinds of export duties and things like that. So early Indian cars, there was a very limited amount of air conditioning technology available. And taxis, because they were sort of on the mass, they were buying cars on the mass market, were actually prohibited in some ways from having air conditioning. And so cool cabs came in to remedy this. And I think that they've just ended up being too expensive. And so many kaali-peelis are trying to get fitted, as we know. They are fitted now with ACs, and you can turn on, if you have it, put on the AC, your fare is higher, etc. But taxi drivers actually see themselves very much as public servants, and the kaali-peeli is part of the public infrastructure. And you're a mazdoor carrying huge amounts of planks of wood to somewhere. You get in a kaali-peeli, it's still inexpensive actually, even though Ola and Uber and all these tell us that theirs is, it's cheaper, blah, 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 but it's really not once you actually pay up. And so AC and all of these things was not really a value because they think of themselves as a public service. Yeah, it's a public service. And it's true, you can jump in a taxi, you could at least jump in a taxi anywhere and go anywhere at any time of the night. And pay, whatever, 13 rupees.
Yeah. Interesting question from Parina. Have the descendants of some of these Juna taxi walas evolved into the auto trade?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Parina. So, interestingly, Chillia, the auto rickshaw labor is actually the most precarious labor in Bombay among the transport trades. And the Chillia have never needed to become precarious labor because they have had this kind of infrastructure of social support and things like that to access the Chillia taxi industry or the hotel industry or the tabela trade. So I am not aware of Chillia, and I'm sure that they exist, but I'm not aware of Chillia auto rickshaw drivers. There are plenty of other auto rickshaw drivers from other parts of the country, and auto rickshaw driving is extremely precarious. You know, it has, they tend to, it tends to be the place where people come and you know, to find a place in the city. But if you're Chilean, you're a new migrant into the city, you can easily access, just by identifying as a Chillia, you can easily identify or access the already existing hotel, tabela, or taxi trades.
You mentioned Pathanwadi quite prominently. Observation from Ajay is that a lot of the kaali-peelis had, or at least, or had the word Bhayandar on it quite prominently. So is there a prominent Chillia settlement in Bhayandar?
You know, there might well be, I don't know. So yes, I agree that lots of taxis are labeled as Bhayandar. And this is, again, you know, taxis are interesting, in Bombay are so interesting because they are moving things, but they're also so, embedded in place, largely because they always say where they're from, Bhayandar, Dadar, Malad, wherever, right? So that's what's fascinating. I don't know actually if there are settlements in Bhayandar, but I think that, you know, a lot of Chillia drivers have settled in places, you know, they certainly in Forest Road, as somebody mentioned. Yes, you know, central Bombay was a very important place. So you'll find a lot of communities in, you know, in and around Bombay Central and those areas. But the folks I've been working with started there. You know, they used to live around in the southern and central parts of Bombay, but they've migrated together up to the Malad area in Pathanwadi. And I suspect this is just like the Sikhs. I suspect this is also, you know, part of the way in which Bombay Muslims have been kind of pushed out of particular residential areas of the city. And so they have, they found housing and residence in places which are, you know, which might be safer for them. And as I said, for other people, they're considered unsafe. You know, I was always told, why are you going into these neighborhoods? And I said, these are actually some of the most vibrant places I have ever been in. And they have so much amazing knowledge. And, you know, watching the mechanics and the ways in which people work with their cars and work with their hands and listen to what's happening, it's actually astounding. It's really astounding. We see them with their car bonnet open and tinkering around in the car on the road. And we say, oh, you know, the Juna taxi is broken down, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, those are really important engagements of people with their means of production that they know just incredibly well.
Is there an anthropological reason for this? Somebody observed that there used to be numerous legendary stories about the taxi driver's honesty or returning forgotten goods. You don't hear such stories anymore.
Yeah, you know, that's such a wonderful question. So Chillia drivers actually consistently say that one of the big kind of moral things that they mention about their own community is this idea that you could do bharosa on them. And I'll be very honest, just as an anecdotal autobiographical question, you know, I first started taking kaali-peelis in Bombay when I was like 13 years old, 12, 13 years old, alone. And my father always used to say, look for a Chillia driver. If you're coming home late at night as a young person, as a young girl alone, look for a Chillia driver, identified by his topi and the white kurta and all of this. And because they are so trustworthy. And I think that they continue to tell stories. I hear stories both from union leaders and from association leaders and from the Chillia community of how mobile phones, suits, briefcases are returned. And actually, you know, I spent a lot of time at the taxi union offices. I just sit there for hours on end watching what's happening. And it's actually quite astounding how much lost material comes back there. You know, taxi drivers will drive from miles away in that horrible Bombay traffic
To return
and
things.
come all the way to the union office in Bombay Central, and you know, and basically give the material back. And so if you're somebody, so those of you who lose things in a car, go to the union office, the Mumbai Taximen union's office. A heck of a lot of stuff is returned there. It's quite astonishing, actually.
So, question from Smriti. Have you looked deeper at the depiction of kaali-peelis and their drivers in Hindi films, 60s, 70s, 80s? Any patterns or thoughts?
Oh, wow.
My taxi driver movie is the movie Taxi Driver, Devanand and Kalpana Karthik.
Devanand, yeah. Oh gosh, great question. That yes, I would love to. That may be my next, because they appear so much in filmic, and I wish. I'm sorry, the video for Gaman didn't work. I love that film too. With it's such a beautifully made film, and yes, absolutely. And this is the, you know, when I say nostalgia, this is the beauty of the kaali-peeli, that it emerges. It has taken on this life of its own, and it appears all the time in films and things. I have not done a systematic study, but that study is there for film scholars or film buffs. It's definitely there, because kaali-peeli show up, and even movies which are not about taxi drivers, kaali-peeli show up in all kinds of places, right? In songs, in silhouettes of the city, and it's there. They're in the landscape. You cannot, you know, just like Marine Drive appears in every Bombay movie, the kaali-peeli also appears in every Bombay movie since the 1950s. Absolutely.
So, thank you, Dr. Tarini. It brings us to the end of our questions. I'm going to remember that line a long, long time. We are Chillia in Mumbai, and we are moving back home. Thank you so much.